Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing incredibly well. And if you're a new subscriber, you're so welcome to the channel. We're so glad you joined us because this is a channel all about fabulous stories that really transform our lives. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. It was a very hot evening in North Carolina. The temperature was like a soaring, scorching 400-degree oven, cooking nothing but hot air. Juliet Silverton sat on her wraparound porch, wearing a pair of scruffy denim jeans, with holes in the knees and pockets, that might have looked intentionally fashionable, but they certainly weren't. Some people paid good money for funky jeans like this. Yet the reality was the holes in the fabric were from genuine wear and tear, when the denim fabric had some rough interactions with thorny briars and barbs, which had lashed out at the fabric angrily, tearing it to shreds. The rich earthen soil clung to her clothes in dark patches, resembling dark brown splatters of paint. The uninvited dirt seemingly lodged itself on the inside of her fingernails, rather unelegantly. Juliet would love to have had pretty fingernails, but industrious yard work and a glossy pink manicure did not go hand in hand. Juliet's honey blonde shoulder-length hair was dampened by the humid heat that clung to her head in cloying limp ringlets, which gave you the misleading impression she had been for a quick dip in the swimming pool. She wiped the perspiration that had gathered on her forehead away with the back of her arm, while what remained of her mascara had simply melted away from the torrid summer day. She did wonder, would there be any end in sight from this unforgiving, relentless tropical heat that had doggedly plagued her life of late? The earth was crying out for rain. The flowers in the field were wilting under the long stretch of summer days, audaciously dictated by sweltering temperatures like a grueling, formidable taskmaster that brought no relief. Indeed, this inauspicious year in North Carolina, the fervid weather was cruel, punishing, contemptuous, the kind of uncongenial, unwelcome friend you would gladly throw out of the house with the bathwater if given the chance. It was as if the winter had simply ignored spring and hurried towards summer without stopping to even draw breath. Juliet Silverton hated the roasting heat with a fervent passion, but her ice-cold glass of homemade lemonade was cooling her down considerably and offering her a momentary relief, and the sweetness of the sugar gave her a quick buzz of much-needed energy, as she felt as deflated as a punctured beach ball and as worn out as a very well-beaten football that had been kicked far too many times. She pondered how the baking heat could suck you dry like nothing else she knew, bringing on feelings of sluggish exhaustion. It was so much easier to be productive in cold weather, she thought. Juliet's floppy white straw summer hat lay on a table beside the rocking chair that had once belonged to her husband's mother. She thoroughly enjoyed rocking in the chair, while overlooking the idyllic, enchanting views over the silvery pond that was graced by hundreds of leafy umbrellas and ethereal-looking pink flowers of the water lily plants that she loved so much, while the weeping, graceful boughs of the willows elegantly cascaded over the water like viridescent feather boas. On many occasions she had been privy to seeing deers and raccoons coming to the water's edge for a quick drink, and would watch them for hours on end as the sun began to set over the valley, painting the sky into an undulating sea of pinks, golds, tangerines and yellows. The sunsets in this part of the world were quite something to behold. Juliet could hear her son Emmett in the front yard, pounding the basketball on the concrete slab, followed by the sound of an unfamiliar truck rolling up the driveway. That was when her son stopped throwing loops and came darting back into the house. 10-year-old Emmett was rather reticent around strangers, or people he was not well acquainted with, which naturally made him retreat into his shell like a tortoise. He was a lot like her late husband in this regard, quite unassuming and self-effacing. Juliet sighed. The last thing in the world she wanted was a visitor right now. Please, God, don't let it be Mrs. Doris Bridshaw. Not again. Not today. Juliet could not bear listening to Doris prattle on and on all the time, like a fishwife about everything and nothing. Doris had firmly decided, after Juliet's husband had died of prostate cancer not too long ago, and had been fortuitously widowed, that it was her Christian duty and responsibility to pay Juliet lots of visits and bring along some of her famous Boston cream pies. Juliet suspected that the woman wanted someone to talk at rather than to, as when Doris visited her, she never got a word in edgeways. It was hardly surprising, Juliet secretly surmised, that Doris's husband never said boo to a goose. He was such a quiet, unassuming man. He must have got used to his voice being confiscated by his garrulous wife. Juliet had secretly thought, if you put a gilded cage around Doris, she'd morph into a very annoying parrot. She always wore the brightest clothes, so when you looked at her, you needed to be wearing a dark pair of glasses. The glare could be blindingly obtrusive, as there was nothing restrained, subtle or subdued about Doris. She was a woman that wanted to be the centre of attention, and almost demanded it. Juliet reluctantly raises herself to her feet, pushing herself off the rocking chair. Every part of her body is aching from the back-breaking, gruelling work she'd been doing earlier in the yard, in clearing some of the paths in the wood. She edges her way to the door, her son following closely behind her, like an obedient lapdog that doesn't want to be parted from its owner. A gold Alfa Romeo convertible swings into her driveway, pulling up beside the basketball net, and Juliet realizes she doesn't recognize this car or the stranger in the front seat. The man remains seated in his car for quite a while. He finally climbs out, slamming the door behind him, all 6'3" of him, that is, with what seems like a reluctant hesitancy. Juliet decided he must be lost. He was possibly going to ask for directions. This would not be the first time people were lost in her part of the world, nor would it be the last. The man tosses his dark black hair, short on the sides and long on the top. He has an olive skin and hazel eyes, with shadows of darker and light gold tones that give him a gentle, almost endearing look. "Can I help you?" asked Juliet. "Are you lost?" "I'm sorry to drop on you unannounced, but I didn't have your cell phone number, so I thought I'd pop in to see you myself, on the off chance you might be willing to spare me a little bit of your time. My name is Clyde Parkington," he says, offering Juliet a firm handshake. "I'm Juliet," she says, reluctantly taking his hand in hers, all too well aware of the fact that her hands are a little filthy from all the yard work she'd been doing earlier on. If she had known someone would pop around spontaneously like this, she'd have given her nails a jolly good scrub. She feels quite self-conscious about her grubby state. Still, it can't be helped. She'd better invite the stranger in, she thinks. He looks as hot and bothered as some of the deflated flowers in her field. "You must excuse my dishevelled appearance," she says. "I've been working in the yard all day. I'm so fatigued, far too tired to change, as the broiling heat completely debilitates me. You're welcome to come in," she says. "I can offer you a lemonade, a glass of white wine, or a gin and tonic." "A lemonade would be great. That would be most kind of you. Alcohol always makes me very sleepy, and I'm driving, so I will stay clear of that if I may." The man follows Juliet onto her wraparound porch and stares out in awe at the countryside from beyond the patio and the silvery pond. "You designed this yard yourself," he says almost dreamily. "I love your pond. It's exquisite. It's like something you would expect to see out of a gardening catalogue. I'm very impressed." "Oh, please," says Juliet modestly, flushing a shade of fuchsia from the unexpected compliment. "That's very kind of you to say. That's right, I did design the yard, if you can call it that." She hands Clyde a large glass of ice-cold lemonade that jiggles with ice cubes, which he takes from her gratefully, as this heat leaves most people feeling very parched. "Ah, this is so good," he says, taking a sip. "I've never known the weather to be this ardently hot. This is very refreshing, just what the doctor ordered. So may I ask you, Mr. Parkington, why you've come to see me today? I've never seen you around town before." "That would be right. You wouldn't have seen me around town. I'm not from this part of the world.
I'm from Boise in Idaho. Believe it or not, I recently learnt a whole lot about you. I attended church last Sunday. I had to find out who it was who landscaped the churchyard. I was given your name there by the church warden, a Mr. Terence Trevelli, who told me you designed the yard for them. I would be very pleased if you would landscape my property for me. I love the way you have done the churchyard. Your borders are controlled, but wild at the same time, where the wildness of the flowers tangle together in tumbling clusters that speak to me of yards written about by the great poets of yesteryear. Your plants are balanced in height and colour and look natural and chaotic at the very same time. I think they call it organised chaos, and I love that look. It's unique, it's individual, immersed with structure like you would expect to find in the Garden of Eden, I imagine, as if nature herself has designed the garden. And yet in truth it is the work of a great artist, of a master gardener. It's an understated natural elegance that I like very much indeed.
Look, that's very nice of you to say, Mr. Parkington. I'm very flattered, and I really appreciate your offer. I'm not a landscape gardener by any manner of means. I only got the job at the churchyard when the pastor popped over to my house after my husband died to offer me some comfort. Let's just say that, like you, he loved the look of my yard and asked if I'd be interested in doing the churchyard for him. At the time I was grateful for some extra money and to keep myself busy and distracted during a time when the grief was unbearable for me. I found doing the yard work helped me to come to terms with my grievous loss. It brought me comfort and solace, kept me busy. I'm not a professional, but I do know an excellent landscape gardener that I can really recommend to you. Clyde Parkington grimaced. He ran his large hand through his thick black mane of hair down the central panel of his head.
Look, Juliet, I'll cut to the chase. I hope you don't mind me calling you by your first name. I don't want any old landscape gardener to do my yard. They're to a penny, very predictable. I'm bored with the bog-standard landscape designs out there. They're lacking in that artistic gift you've clearly got. I want someone who has a natural flair in making a yard look like a perfect flowery meadow, as if God himself designed it. I love your work. It's inspirational. It's art. But without it being obvious, that is. I want that for my yard, and I will pay you what it takes for you to do the job. How about $60,000 for starters, and with 3 fully paid workers to do all the hard work for you, so that they can do the back-busting chores, while you play the role of the conductor who makes the music happen, if you get my drift.
Juliet almost gasped in astonishment. $60,000. That was not money to be sneezed at. It could buy her a brand new truck, a trip on a cruise liner even. $60,000, she pipes. Are you being serious?
Of course I'm being serious. You can work at your own time, but the sooner you start on the job, the better. The house is now being completed. I'm looking forward to moving into the place, but only when the property is completed. I'm leaving Idaho and moving here to North Carolina. Before you ask, I'm not married, nor do I have children. I devoted my early life to running a software company, which I sold recently. So I'm retiring early, at the grand old age of 50. It was always my plan to retire young, so that I could travel, play golf, devote my spare time to my pottery. So it's just the yard that needs tending to, and planning, with your ingenuous flamboyant flair. I think I should warn you that the builders working on the property claimed that there were some kind of, paranormal activity going on at the house. The irony is those builders had not believed in ghosts before they worked on my property, but now they most certainly do, after the strange events that transpired during the building project. They were claiming they were being poked in the ribs and having their hair pulled at times. They could sometimes hear children laughing and tiny feet running all over the place. It alarmed them quite a bit, but they sensed it was just spirit children messing with them, so they never felt they were in danger. But to be fair to them, they completed the job. I'm sure lesser men would have abandoned the job in a heartbeat, so they were excellent workers. The house looks outstanding, I'm pleased to report.
How interesting, says Juliet. I've never visited a place that was haunted before. It could be quite eye-opening for me. I mean, I've watched some of those paranormal programs on television, of course, but I've never been privy to experiencing anything outer-worldly before.
Well, to be fair, says Mr. Parkington, I've been around that house multiple times myself, and I've seen and heard nothing. So I'm slightly cynical of the builder's claims, I have to say. I find it hard to get my head around stuff like that. I can't help wondering if someone left a radio on or something.
If you don't mind my saying, if that were the case, how do you explain the poking of the ribs, the hair being pulled, the little children's laughter, the running around the place? That doesn't sound like a trick to me. That sounds paranormal.
One of the builders could possibly be playing a trick on the others. That's what I sometimes think, says Mr. Parkington, taking a sip of lemonade.
Really? You do surprise me, says Julia, raising a quizzical eyebrow. I doubt that somehow. Does the house have a history by any chance? You often find old houses can sometimes have a reputation for being haunted. My father used to say that houses are like sponges. They absorb the history of a place, especially if something traumatic happened there. It can be replayed back in our time.
There is, as it happens. I mean, it's an old colonial house. Lots of history about it. And there is a story connected to the house. The wife, a woman called Isadora Holden, was the lady of the house. They hired a young Irish lady's maid called Tilly, who would help Isadora get dressed and would brush her long dark hair. You know, all the duties of a lady's maid. It seemed that Tilly fell pregnant after a clandestine affair with Isadora's husband, who was claimed to have a bit of a roving eye at the time. When the wife learnt the young girl had betrayed her trust, she was utterly mortified, and the horrifying news that Tilly was 7 months pregnant with her husband's baby made her incandescent with rage. I can't say I blame her. One of her close members of staff informed her about the relationship that had been occurring under her roof. She was outraged by Tilly's duplicity, but also gravely humiliated about the shame it would bring upon her family name if anyone was to learn about the pregnancy beyond her home, as family honour was very big in those days, and a soiled reputation brought with it bountiful shame. For Isadora there were deeper issues at stake. Beyond that, I have to say, as 2 of her children have died of smallpox. A boy called Augustus, he was 8 years old, and a young girl, Henrietta, who was 7. She was furiously jealous that this presumptuous little madam, a little lady's maid, had beguiled her husband, and would soon be giving birth to her husband's baby. Isabella was barren, and could not birth any more children. So she pushed Tilly down the stairs, in a spontaneous, unplanned burst of jealous rage. I mean, the poor woman had lost 2 of her own children, and now her lady's maid Tilly was having her husband's 3rd child. After being pushed down the staircase, the young woman went into contractions. She delivered a premature baby that died soon after birth, as in those days they didn't cope with premature births like we do today, and many babies just died when they were born too early. Little Tilly was broken-hearted about her baby's unheralded death, which was made significantly worse by the fact that Isadora's husband no longer paid Tilly any special attention. She was found hanging from the inside of the closet in Isadora's bedroom. The woman apparently screamed her lungs out to discover little Tilly hanging there. I imagine she knew she was responsible for the young girl's death, and was plagued with a dreadful guilt.
And you moved into the house knowing all this? You're a brave man, Mr. Clyde Parkington. And in truth, I don't know whether that's a compliment or an insult. You see, I'm quite sure buying a house with a history like that would leave me running for the hills.
Well, I haven't moved into the house yet, says Clyde, laughing at Juliet's reaction. I admit the estate agent warned me the house was reputed to being haunted, But I don't take much notice of things like that. Well, I didn't, until the builders started to report the bizarre incidents that gave me pause for reflection. But as I keep telling you, I've stayed over the place numerous times. The house is fully furnished now. I found a very good interior designer, who's good with 17th to 18th century furnishings. I hasten to say, I never saw anything untoward going on in the house. I never heard little children giggling, nor did I have my hair pulled.
Are you telling me you weren't just a teensy-weensy bit bothered by what the builders and estate agent actually told you? As I was saying, if the boot were on the other foot, I wouldn't move into the house with that kind of history. It would bother me very much if someone was rumoured to have hung themselves in the house. Please don't tell me you're going to move into that bedroom, where Tilly the lady's maid was found hanging.
I am, as it happens, but stuff like that doesn't bother me. I mean, it happened an awfully long time ago. And even if ghosts are real, they can't exactly hurt you, can they?
I'm not so sure about that. And let's just say it's not exactly true. I've heard that violent hauntings can actually hurt you. People have been attacked by ghosts before, you know, flung down staircases, actually hit and punched. Don't you believe that houses absorb the energy of the people that lived there once before? So if something bad transpired in your house, surely it's left an impression.
I'm not sure if I believe in all that. Now let's just change the subject, shall we? I've got the key for the house, which you will need to use for your convenience whenever necessary. Like using the toilets, washing your hands, keeping your food refrigerated, making coffee. Feel free to have a shower there any time you desire. I won't be around, but as I say, make yourself at home. You can use the downstairs office for any phone calls you might wish to make to various suppliers. If you need to take a nap on any of the beds upstairs, you're welcome. I realise the heat can be insufferable at this time of the year, so you are welcome to take as many naps as you like.
Thank you, I do appreciate that. I do like to take cat naps in weather like this, so you're speaking my language. You don't want me to draw up any plans for your yard to show you first?
Absolutely not. I want you to feel the place. Follow your natural instincts about what you want to do to the yard. Give me a call if you need anything. Just order any of the yard materials and plants that you need from the Fairview Garden Centre. I have an account with them there, and they will deliver to my address personally.
Juliet's account. What had I done? I wasn't exactly sure. I'd agreed to do some yard work for a respectable, rather charming gentleman by the name of Clyde Parkington, whom had popped into my life unexpectedly, like an unusual perennial in the meadow, that I couldn't actually identify. He was an interesting man, rather an idiosyncratic character, whom had never been married before, and was retiring at 50 years old, after having sold off his software company, and now he was choosing to settle in North Carolina for a change of scene. Don't get me wrong, but if I was retiring, I would be more inclined to buy a place by the coast. But each to his own, I suppose. This eminent man, whom had breezed through my life like an unexpected, welcome, cool easterly wind, wanted to pay me $60,000 to inject my artistic touches into his yard. I was flattered he liked my work. I've always thoroughly enjoyed being omnific and inventive in the yard, and suffusing flamboyant colours into the landscape, almost as if the land itself has purged these flowers naturally through the earth, without it seeming obvious that a human was involved in this natural sequence of events. I must confess, admitting that the builders had been experiencing paranormal activity on the property left me feeling, well, let's just say rather curious. But I doubted I would be privy to any ghostly interactions myself, as I imagined ghosts possibly only haunted the hallways at night, when I was unlikely to be on the property at the time. Suffice to say, I rarely needed the money, and so procuring an extra $60,000 was not money I could afford to actually turn away. I was hardly going to look a gift horse in the mouth. That would be a foolish thing to do. I had little Emmett, my 10-year-old son, to consider. "You're going to make Mr. Parkington's yard look nice, Mummy. Like ours. You're going to make his look like ours." "That's right, sweetheart. I am." When I married my husband, I'd only just graduated from college. I'd never ever taken a job a day in my life. But if there was anything I did know my stuff about, it was gardens, as flowers and plants and trees had always been a passion for me. I think I found I could express my creativity in the yard. Suffice to say, news gets around rather fast in a small town. And as can be expected, when Mrs. Doris Bridgeshaw learnt that I was going to plan the yard for Mr. Parkington's home, she became incredibly animated. I was surprised she knew about the history of the old colonial house. But then why was I surprised? In truth, what did Mrs. Doris Bridgeshaw not know about people's lives? She was like a ferret, putting her nose into everybody's business. I remember she came running into my house in a bright emerald green dress that was weighted down by an excess of heavy beads. On this occasion she sauntered into my house like a bright green frenzied cyclone, catching me completely off guard, as on this occasion she'd forgotten to knock on my door. It was once again an insufferable hot day, and Mrs. Bridgeshaw was fanning herself with a Chinese fan. At the time I was squeezing lemons and stirring a pot of sugar syrup on the range oven to make more homemade lemonade. I looked up in surprise to see Mrs. Bridgeshaw staring at me with enthusiastic eyes. "Well, tell me, is it true? Is it true?" "Is what true?" I ask. "That you're going to be doing the yard work on the Rochester property. You know that old colonial house that's been fixed up recently?" "How do you know about that?" I asked incredulously. "Well, I have my sources. Of course I know what goes on around here." "So it is true, then?" "It's true," I said. "The kettle's just boiled. Would you like some tea?" "If you're having some, that would be fabulous." "I wouldn't go there if you paid me $1 million, she informed me, her fingers trembling excitedly as she began shaking the teacup in her hand and almost spilling it all over my kitchen countertop. I retrieved some toweling paper to dab up the mess. "You don't know about the history of the house, do you?" She lowers her voice to a faint whisper. "You do know. The place is supposed to be haunted." "I'm well aware of that." Mrs. Bridgeshaw's eyes grow as wide as saucers. "Someone hung themselves in that house. I think it was the lady's maid." "I heard about that too. I believe her name was Tilly, the lady's maid, I mean." "Do you know why the Rochesters actually sold that house? Do you know the real reason?" "I'm guessing because it was haunted." "Worse than that. They'd be awoken to a woman's screams in the middle of the night. They say it was the sound of the lady of the house, called Isadora. She was screaming when she discovered her lady's maid hanging from inside the closet. It's quite some story, isn't it? Aren't you bothered to be going there? To be working there?" "No, I need the money. I enjoy working with plants, and I imagine most ghostly activity happens during the night. Although what?" asks Mrs. Bridgeshaw. "Well, as it happens, Mr. Parkington did say the builders complained during daytime hours of being jabbed in the ribs by little hands, having their hair pulled, and hearing children laughing. But nothing bad happened. It was all just harmless." "Well, good for you, Juliet. You're a lot braver than me. Promise me this, though. If anything weird, outer-worldly happens in the house, you will let me know about it." "Of course," I say. I wouldn't dare not tell you. And so began the gardening project for Mr. Parkington's property. The first time I laid my eyes on the house, for a brief moment, I felt almost as if I'd been transported back to another time in our history. I almost felt out of place standing there, in my scruffy jeans and floppy hat. I felt way too underdressed, as if I should be wearing a fabulously ornate gown. I had arrived at the property on this occasion to walk around, to get a feel for the place, to contemplate on what I could do to transform the yard. I parked my car on the semicircular driveway there, which was the only flat area around the house. I just stood there staring at the very charming house, like a large sea sponge, just soaking it all in. This imposing, spectacular mansion had a restrained but stately elegance about it, with white walls, black shutters, large windows. But although it seemed settled on its foundations, that had rooted themselves into the soil, there was a sad energy to the home that I picked up almost immediately, as if the house was basking in its own melancholia. I glanced up at a window, certain I'd seen a movement. It was as if I'd seen a face staring down at me. It was so fleeting, so quick, that I was convinced I'd imagined it. When I pinned my eyes onto the window in question, there was nothing there. Of course, I told myself it was just a trick of the light. The sunshine that day was unrelenting, as it had been all summer, viciously pounding through the skies, with a bright glaring light.
and a heat so torrid, so hot, that I was beginning to sweat, and it was still so early in the morning. I glance around at the surrounding transfixing views, and that's when I appreciate why Mr. Parkington bought this property. It was not so much the house that had tickled his fancy, I don't believe. It was the arresting countryside that surrounded it. The house itself was parked, like a grand ocean liner, in the middle of an enchanting valley, surrounded by the impassionate fury of the billowing ocean waves. In this case, the waves were rolling hills that danced around the house in sumptuous meadows of verdant grass and pretty flowers. The house was fringed by large clusters of trees that stretched up into a steep elevation. In the furthest distance, the skyline was plundered by the majestic contours of the mountains that seized your attention and demanded your respect. In the morning light, their voluptuous silhouettes seemed to melt like chocolate into a purple blue-like haze. I found my heart fluttering with excitement as I thought about how I would clear out the undershrubbery in the woodgrove and invite some shade-loving plants and flowers to occupy that gorgeous space. How I would bring wild indigenous flowers to impregnate the landscape with vibrant, rich colours, while I would invite the naked walls of the house to embrace the tumbles of pretty climbing roses, along with purple wisteria, so that the house could wear a scarf around her neck, in a tangled confetti of colour. It was poetry in the making. Mr. Parkington had been true to his word, and help had been recruited on my behalf to help me with some of the back-breaking work, while the nursery gallantly delivered all the plants and materials I needed for the job on hand. One day, when the oppressive North Carolina heat was so insufferable, it had almost seared through my clothes like a hot oven, I knew I needed to seek refuge in the house just to cool down. The fatigued, burnt-out workers had already left for the day. Fortunately, my son was staying overnight at his best friend's house, and I was frankly too jaded to actually go home. I decided I'd have a quick cat nap in one of the bedrooms, and then once I was physically revived and restored, I would drive home. I chose a well-appointed, attractive, air-conditioned bedroom with a queen-sized bed. I pulled the curtains closed to darken the room, and I crashed out on the bed. Imagine my surprise to wake up in the middle of the night in a strange house. Where was I? I sat up with a start, glancing at my cell phone, feeling rather confused and disorientated. I could not comprehend what I was doing in Mr. Parkington's house, lying on one of his beds. It seemed rather strange to me, and then I remembered that I'd taken a brief cat nap and clearly fallen asleep. I glanced briefly at my cell phone. It was 10 o'clock at night. Are you kidding me? The bed I'd been lying in was so cool, and the sleep I'd enjoyed was better than I'd experienced in a long time. And as my son was staying at his friend's house, I had no responsibilities, so I decided I'd stay overnight at Mr. Parkington's property. It was frankly far too much effort to make the journey home. I had a packed lunch that I'd failed to eat during the day because it was just too hot, so I ambled down to the kitchen and grabbed my lunchbox while I made myself a quick cup of coffee. That was when I heard the giggles and feet running around the upper landing, and I knew no one was there. Then I heard the sound of a tennis ball bouncing up and down. It was flying down the sweeping staircase and then rolling into the kitchen, but no one was there. My hair began to stand on edge. It seemed so surreal. "Hello," I called, picking up the ball. "Is anyone there?" But I was met with silence. You would think at this point I would hightail it out of Mr. Parkington's house, get into my truck, and return home faster than a March hare. But I was too exhausted to actually care. I told myself it was probably the spirit children that the builders had encountered, but they were harmless enough. Why should I worry? I retreated to my bedroom, feeling slightly more apprehensive. Let's just say my shattered state had somewhat hijacked my cognitive ability to reason or to make sense of these outer-worldly occurrences. I returned to the bedroom and swiftly fell fast asleep. I can't remember a time when I was more exhausted. I awoke with a start to the sound of these ear-piercing shrill screams later on in the night that were so discomposing, so disturbing, they could have shattered glass. It was the most terrifying noise that even my mug of coffee on the side table next to the bed began to rattle under its vibration. It was a murderous, disembodied-like scream.
If I hadn't known about the history of the house, I would have thought someone was being murdered, not too far away from me. My heart began to pound violently in my chest at 1,000 miles an hour. A cold chill ran down my spine, while every hair on the back of my neck was standing up on edge. Was that the scream of Isadora when she discovered the lady's maid hanging in the closet? I don't know what on earth possessed me. Let's just say, brave is not exactly my middle name, and courage is not something that has ever ingratiated itself towards my personality. But I unhesitantly, unflinchingly dashed towards the furthest room in the house that in the cold light of day I had been grudgingly opposed to visit, as this was the ill-fated, infelicious room where the lady's maid Tilly was fortuitously found hanging in the closet. I had been far too anxious to go in there, but an irrational, illogical courage overcame me, and cautiously I opened the door of the main bedroom. It's cold as ice as the freezing air blasts at my neck, but there's no air conditioning in this room, which should have been muggy, given the stifling conditions outside. The room feels airily spooky. I get the overwhelming sense that I'm being watched. There's no wind in the room, but the long sweeping curtains are literally rocking backwards and forwards on the curtain rails, without any antagonist. The closet door is wide open. The door is swinging on its hinges, making an ominous, unsettling squeaking sound that rather reminds me of white chalk on a teacher's classroom board when it scratches the surface. I quickly close the closet door, cringing as the thought that this is possibly the pretentious, direful location where Tilly's hanging body was recovered. I suddenly hear a muffled woman's sob, and feet scurrying past me quickly, like a fast-moving wind. I feel the vibration and hear the sound of flat women's shoes as they scurry down the staircase at a speed that shocks even me. And for a brief, fleeting second, I get a glimpse of a woman's profile as I glance down at the staircase. It is rather like looking at a faded photograph of a woman in 1800s clothes, although her profile appears very real. I notice the figure is quite translucent, as I can see directly through her, yet I can still see her quite clearly. The woman turns around and briefly looks at me. She hurries out of the house. For some irrational, implausible reason, I so want to comfort her, for in that moment, in the woman's dark eyes, I had sensed a dreadful, sorrowful grief. I quickly put on my boots that I'd left by the front door, grabbing a torch that has conveniently been left on the hall table, like an unlikely blessing. I open the front door and hurriedly find myself running after the woman. There are moments when her body becomes solid, as if she's as real as you or me. Hold on, I call after her. I had in mind that I'd talk to her about what had transpired in the house all those years ago, as I hoped that she might be able to forgive herself for what had happened to Tilly. I knew the events that had occurred were ultimately a consequence of a husband's adulterous behaviour, a wife's grief in losing her children to smallpox, and the lady's maid Tilly, who had betrayed her trust. I was hoping a few words might help her to see that pushing Tilly down the staircase was wrong, but it was no more wrong than Tilly's affair with her husband and her husband's cheating behaviour. I wanted this poor woman to forgive herself for what had transpired. A sudden impulsive rush of anger had pushed her lady's maid down the stairs, which had resulted in a premature baby dying soon after its birth, and Tilly taking her own life. Now the poor woman was cocooned in the despair of her self-condemnation. "Stop! Please stop! Can I have a word? Just a brief word? Please don't go!" I'll never forget that night. It was almost as muggy as the day had been. There were mosquitoes buzzing around, trying to bite me, but I didn't care. The moonlight was so pretty tonight, generous in her vibrancy, as she caressed the rolling countryside magnanimously with a luminescent silvery glaze that was ethereal, very fetching, reducing the daunting demeanour of the billowing terrain that can so easily trip you up in the darkness, as the ground here is not exactly flat. The silvery stars boldly danced from the canopy of the sky, shining as brightly as twinkling diamonds. I am clumsily manhandling the torch and flickering its beams all over the place. It seems nonsensical to be following a ghost for inexplicable reasons even I can't fathom. By all accounts, I'd never consider running into the woodgrove during the night like this, especially not after something or someone that has long since passed away. So what the hell is wrong with me? I'm driven by an audacious determination that does not belong to me, almost as if I'm wearing a piece of borrowed clothing that I'm not entirely comfortable in, as it doesn't exactly fit me. The vague hazy silhouettes of the tall vertical trees that plunder the skyline, in a regal elegance, seem to morph into dark sultry beings under the cover of darkness. It's what you don't see that is the most intimidating, as anything could be loitering in the dark shadows. And for me, that is the most discomposing feeling. Suffice to say, I enter the woodgrove, my torchlight swinging to the left and right. I try to look for the ghostly apparition, and then something gets my attention that astonishes me so much that to this day I'm still inclined to say, what the hell? Let's just say of all the most unlikely, incongruous things to ever happen to a person, it happened to me. I hear a sound. I move towards it instinctively. Then standing before me, larger than life, is a Herculean-sized male Bigfoot. This I did not expect to see. Not at all. Indeed, you don't ever expect to see something that you don't actually believe exists. But there he was, standing before me, with a magisterial grace that was reverential and imposing. I certainly perceived that he did want to be seen by me. He wasn't trying to hide, nor was he evasive or reticent, but very clearly desirous to engage my full attention. He stood there for a long while, like a lamppost on a street corner, as if he was helping me to assimilate him in all his lofty, towery majesty. I was too shocked and befuddled to even recruit any fear. It was like I was immersed in a wild, fantabulous dream, almost like Alice in Wonderland, that had no bearing with reality whatsoever. So it just can't be true, can it? Yet I'm enjoying the peculiarity of my dream, its lucid, bizarre details. Part of me does not want to wake up, but I feel I must, so I rub my eyes vigorously. But I'm still standing here in the forest, staring at a male Bigfoot. The creature is different to the Patterson footage I'd seen years before. For a start, this creature is much taller, much wider, with a taut muscle definition that would certainly be the envy of any aspiring bodybuilder. His Titanic-sized shoulders would make an NFL quarterback shoulders look ridiculously inconspicuous and possibly even puny. He's covered in sweeping dark long hair, the colour of a raven's feather, and although it caresses his body, it is not patchy, but thick and luxuriant. His face is so startlingly human, his demeanour almost angelic. He has golden eyes that are incredibly kind. I notice he has overlong arms that taper down to beyond his knees. Then I hear in my head very articulate words that are commanding in their authority and persuasively influential.
"We've been waiting for you. I'm very glad you've come. She needs your help. Come with me now."
The voice that's speaking into my head is not mine. It's husky, masculine, deep, low. I look up in the creature's face and realise he's spoken directly to my mind. Is this how someone speaks to you telepathically, I wonder? The creature's indicating for me to follow him. I don't hesitate. Once again, I feel like invisible hands are guiding me, propelling me ever forwards. The creature points towards the apparition, who's sitting on the ground sobbing. She doesn't look translucent. She looks as solid as a regular human being, only she's wearing a Victorian bustle skirt with a buttoned bodice. I notice 2 ghostly children are standing between the trees next to the Bigfoot, watching their mother, who doesn't appear to see them or even acknowledge that they're there. I have the sense that they've been trying to get her attention for a very, very long time. But she's so ensnared and entrenched in her grief and self-recrimination, and even her guilt has suctioned out all her joy. She doesn't notice them.
"Speak to her."
The Bigfoot's voice enters my head again.
"She needs your help. She needs to go to the light."
"Hello, Isadora," I say. "You don't know me. You see, I'm from another time. The 20th century, actually, to be exact. My name is Juliet.
I heard all about your sad story. I understand you blame yourself for pushing Tilly down the stairs in a moment of mad, impassionate anger. Let me say this. Your husband cheated on you, Isadora. Your lady's maid, Tilly, betrayed you. Yes, you reacted badly to what happened all those years ago. I would have been mad as hell if that had happened to me. And you had every reason to be aggrieved. But all of you did something wrong. You don't have a monopoly on guilt here. If your husband and lady's maid had behaved themselves in the first place, none of this would ever have transpired. It was like a pack of cards that was naturally waiting to fall down. Tilly might have taken her own life, but if she had not fallen pregnant, none of this would have happened. You can't be responsible for the choices other people make. You can't go through your afterlife condemning yourself for what happened. I do hope you do know that you are dead. You need to just let it go. Forgive yourself. You need to go to the light. Don't be afraid to go to the light. Your 2 children are here for you. They've been waiting for you. They want to escort you back to your home. Please go with them. To my amazement, the ghostly woman turns around. I see her so clearly. Her dark eyes light up, and she suddenly sees her children for the first time. They run towards her. The next thing I know, they're embracing. I watch them as they hold their mother's hands, and they guide her away, and they all vanish before my eyes. The Bigfoot looks at me, pats me on the back. You've helped her. She's gone to the light. She's at peace now. We've been waiting for you for a long time. He nods his head and glides away. I couldn't believe what had happened. To cut a long story short, I finished Clyde's beautiful yard for him. He was thrilled with the results. The yard on his property looked as if nature herself had splurged out a vibrant opulence on his meadow that looks like a gift from nature herself, rather than the intervention of meticulous hands that engaged in so much work to create that understated effect. Needless to say, it would seem that Clyde Parkington has not experienced any paranormal activity in his home. I noticed that the entire building had changed significantly, as if a weight had been lifted off its foundations. This is the first time I've shared my story, as some things in life are too incredulous to explain. But I will say this. I believe Bigfoots can see into the spirit world, can help spirits pass on, and help a restless spirit. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.